On this channel, we are primarily focusing on the world's great rivers and lakes. However, there are other water bodies that are significant enough to include in this series because of their importance to global commerce, changes in the environment, or regional influence that raises their importance. For example, the Rhine-Main-Danube Canal is a constructed channel that served to link Eastern and Western Europe. In this presentation, we are going to look at the Erie Canal, which connected the eastern seaboard of the United States with the Great Lakes region and began opening the interior of the nation to trade and development. In the eastern part of the United States, the colonies were established east of the Appalachian Adirondack mountain chain. All the rivers from here flowed east from the range to the ocean. This meant that waterborne travel could only go so far west before one ran out of water. If one wanted to get oneself or one's goods across this divide, you would need to haul them overland, using a wagon or the muscles of your back. This method of getting goods from the East Coast into the interior of the United States was laborious, time-consuming, and expensive. These factors resulted in the interior of the United States being underdeveloped by Europeans. It also led to a very European focus in the trade of the United States because it was easier and faster to move goods east rather than west. George Washington, as the first president of the United States, knew that the entire nation would benefit if there could be a way to connect the Great Lakes region or the Mississippi River Basin with the East Coast. The James River Canal, a portion of which is pictured here, was one attempt to connect the East Coast with the interior. While the canal did connect the interior of Virginia with the East Coast and worked around several blockages, it was never able to achieve the vision of connecting to the Ohio River and breaking through the Appalachian Divide. The difficulty in building canals in early America was not restricted to the landscape barrier and the physical difficulty with digging a canal. In addition, there were financial challenges that came into play when exploring how to build a canal to connect the nation. At the time, a canal was considered an internal improvement, and there were questions among the early federal legislators and presidents on whether building improvements was even constitutionally allowed. This debate and the resistance of these early elected officials meant that any canals would need to be built using non-federal funds. There was clearly value in building a canal that connected the eastern seaboard with the interior of the continent. The questions that needed to be answered were, where was the canal going to be built? How would it be built? Who would pay for it? And when would it happen? Remarkably, these questions were answered sooner than one would have expected. It was the businessmen and commercial interests in New York State that pressured Governor DeWitt Clinton to begin the process of considering how to build a canal. The vision of building the canal was not seen in a charitable or good governance light. The vision for the canal was that one would improve the commercial environment for investors and others who wanted to do business in the interior of the nation. And of course, the merchants in New York City would not suffer from the expected surge of trade and commercial activity. The Erie Canal was going to be the engineering marvel of the time. In order to connect Lake Erie with the Hudson River and downstream to New York, the canal would have to be able to lift and lower ships about 550 feet. This would require the development of many innovative techniques that would be limited to the technology of the day. In addition to design and engineering skills, you were limited to the equipment of the early 1800s. There were no backhoes or earth movers, and dynamite would not be invented for another 40 years. How would you go about digging this canal through rock and earth and do it in a timely fashion? If we go back to the early 1800s, what did they have to use to dig a channel? Well, they had rudimentary tools such as shovels, pickaxes, and the man or animal-powered hoist to lift and place rock. When these machines were measured in horsepower, it really was the power of a horse. Harnessing up Old Charlie was the machine power of the day. While they did not have modern dynamite, they were able to use gunpowder for some limited blasting. However, this was not the perfected blasting science that we have today. Rather, there was a lot of estimation and guessing to see what would work, which I'm sure caused a lot of accidents and a lot of failure. While working on the canal paid reasonable wages for the day, at least in the beginning, the construction environment was definitely not a day in the park. Illness and disease were common, and injuries were disabling and often fatal. Remember, there were no workplace safety rules in force at the time. If you got crushed, you may have gotten a ticket home, where, if you were lucky, you lived a short, painful existence on family and local charity. The work for many was so bad that they did what they could to keep their friends and family from making the mistake of coming to seek work on this massive construction project. The building dimensions for the canal seem fairly small by today's standards, but it was an unprecedented human effort to link two bodies of water. The original design called for digging a channel 4 feet deep and 40 feet wide at the top. The canal would stretch 363 miles, although a chunk of it would use the Mohawk River. In addition, remember, the canal would not be carrying self-powered ships. This meant there had to be an adjacent towpath that would allow ships to be pulled up and down the canal because it would be almost impossible to sail any ships in the required linear fashion. With more than 500 feet of elevation separating the two endpoints of the canal, and only 360 miles of distance to be traveled, this could not be a single-flow canal. Rather, ships would have to move in a stepwise fashion up and down the canal. This would require using locks to create a bathtub effect where water flowed into the lock, lifted the boat to the equalized height of the canal, and released it at the new elevation. The original canal had 83 locks, so that was a lot of stopping, lifting or lowering, and then moving on to the next stage. Not terribly fast, but faster than any other transport of the period. Having talked about how the canal was designed and built, let's take a bit of a look at where the canal was going to run. In order to be as efficient as possible, the canal had to connect as many bodies of water as it worked its way to the Lake Erie. This involved moving up the Mohawk River to Rome, New York, and continuing west towards Rochester, before finally ending up in Buffalo. There is also a spur from the Lake Erie connection to Lake Ontario to connect the larger Great Lakes Basin with the Hudson and the Atlantic Ocean. Because of the resistance at the federal level to fund internal improvements, the Erie Canal would have to be built without federal funds. DeWitt Clinton drew together a coalition that consisted of a narrow majority in the state legislature and managed to craft a funding bill to use state funds to build the canal. Again, this was not a vision of altruistic generosity. The vision of expanded markets and the ability to move trade through the Hudson rather than down the Mississippi was a major motivator in aligning funds to build this massive project. Construction started in 1817 with the first shovel moving the first bit of dirt and rock. 9,000 laborers worked over the next several years to dig, move, or blast the channel and build the locks and other infrastructure needed to make sure the canal would be able to move shipping from the Hudson to Lake Erie. Finally, in 1825, the last bit of work was completed and the canal was opened. And on the first trip with the ship between Lake Erie and the Hudson River using the Erie Canal, DeWitt Clinton, sticking a thumb in the eye of his critics, mingled the waters of the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Erie, connecting the Great Lakes, and by extension, much of the upper Midwest with the Atlantic Ocean, through the Hudson River. It was not long before the canal began to meet and then exceed the expectations of its funders. First, moving goods through the canal took a fraction of the time it took to move the same product overland. In addition, shipping through the canal jumped by orders of magnitude on a regular basis. This massive amount of goods moving through the canal invigorated New York City, not only growing its port, but also all of the associated services that went with supporting that transportation. Of course, as with most major infrastructure projects, the canal was undersized from almost the time of its completion. Shipping sizes would increase both in width and depth. There were two major upgrades to the canal. One started in 1836, which expanded the canal to 70 feet wide and 7 feet deep. There is another expansion that was completed in 1918, where the canal was widened to 125 feet and deepened to 12 feet. There are also additional locks added to allow for two-way transport up and down the system. This second expansion also saw a significant rerouting of the canal to use more rivers and lakes, with the resulting abandonment of much of the original dug channel. The second expansion also saw the removal of the ox path. With the development of mechanization and switching to internal engines, shipping no longer needed to use draft horses to pull barges. This conversion was the passing of a distinctive age of maritime travel along the canal. The horses, like old Charlie who helped build the canal, and then towboats up and down the channel, were finally put out to pasture. Technology and the modernizing of the transportation system would eventually render the canal obsolete. The introduction and spread of rail to cities such as Chicago and St. Louis would allow freight to be shipped overland, no longer confined to one of the world's great waterways. Now cities with no direct connection to a harbor could still receive freight shipped from around the world. The development of the interstate highways and the expansion of trucking would further decouple freight shipping from waterways. Finally, the St. Lawrence Seaway would provide the final nail in the coffin of the canal by creating a large system that allowed larger ships to get into the Great Lakes, bypassing this once great channel. With the decline of shipping in the canal, there was no longer a significant need to invest in the maintenance of the channel. Therefore, the built infrastructure within the canal began to deteriorate, and the barges that once navigated up and down the canal were left in harbor to rot. The canal was well on the way to dying, and maybe being even lost to progress had it been filled in. The rebirth of the canal started from an unusual source. In 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act. This act helped to highlight the value of water and identified that recreational use of the nation's rivers and lakes, and by extension, the canals, was an important resource. As swimming and fishing were important aspects of clean water, attention to the use of canals as a recreational resource served to act as a defibrillator, giving the canal another jolt of life. People came back to the Erie Canal to explore those recreational resources such as paddling and biking on the towpaths. Once again, the canal served as a visionary recreational corridor that would carry people up and down the waterway. But now the canal was used for enjoyment which created economic development for the region. Once again, the canal was driving commercial development for the neighboring towns. In addition to recreational development, the canal's history was being appreciated. In 2000, Congress authorized the establishment of the Erie Canal Heritage Corridor. The corridor is 524 miles long and contains many historic sites and parks where people can learn about the history of this great waterway and appreciate more than 200 years of history. With the revitalization of the canal and the recognition of its historical importance, it is not just bikers and paddlers who are using the canal. The Erie Canal barges are back, and if you are adventurous, you can rent a barge and transport yourself up and down the canal. I say go for it. Just make sure you learn the 19th century canal transportation language. You don't want to be seen as a poser out there. Canals, being constructed waterways, are particularly at the mercy of public whim. The Erie Canal is an example of this. The canal was born from the dream of connecting the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes. Many men suffered and died to build the canal, but the dream was realized, and the waters were mingled. However, while the Erie Canal was a technological marvel of its time, it was not long before it was obsolete and needed significant modernization. However, the race for modernization is never won, and the canal lost out as it was replaced by other modes of transportation. And this would have been the end of the story. However, not for the Erie Canal. Once people realized that water was a valuable resource and remembered the historical importance of the Erie Canal, the dream of the canal was changed and revived. It was not long before the canal was repurposed and now serves a new audience. The Erie Canal is the story of the birth, rise, fall, and rebirth of one of the world's great rivers and lakes.